and welcome to We the People, brought to you by the League of Women Voters of Minneapolis. I'm Catherine Shreves, and Doris Baylor and I will be your host tonight. Our guest tonight is Dr. William Green, more informally known to everyone in Minneapolis as Bill Green, former superintendent of the Minneapolis Public Schools, former chair of the school board, and now a history professor at Augsburg University, and author of 3 books on African American history in Minnesota. His most recent book, which came out just about a year ago now, is Children of Lincoln: White Paternalism and the Limits of Black Opportunity. Welcome, Bill.
Hi, thank you for having me.
We're happy to have you.
We're very happy to have you. Let's start with the title of this book. I want to get it correct. Children of Lincoln. And you mentioned that Frederick Douglass said in a speech that white people were the children of Lincoln, and black people were at best his stepchildren. Tell us a little more about that.
That statement was given in a dedication of the Freedmen's, or the Emancipation Memorial in Washington, one of the first monuments to go up in Washington. And at that, it depicts Abraham Lincoln standing with his arms outstretched and a huddled slave kneeling at his knee. And he has the chains still on, but the chains are broken. And it struck me, as it did other historians, that it was a monument to white paternalism. Because it was basically a situation where Abraham Lincoln was going to be the savior for the African American. But once the African American is free, there's no more duty to support the African American as they develop, as they stand up, and you don't see the kind of relationship that's able to form when the former slave could actually look Abraham Lincoln in the eye, could actually be equal. When that statute was unfurled in Washington in 1876, the people responded in 2 different ways. The white people present saw it as a beautiful monument, and it is a beautiful monument, artistically, aesthetically. But the African Americans who were in that crowd didn't respond in the same way. In fact, the reporter for the New York Times at the time made that observation and said that there seemed to be some disquieting response on the part of African Americans. When the speech was delivered, it would be at the time where Reconstruction was ending, the time where we're trying to heal the country as a result of the Civil War. But what had happened instead was that more terroristic activities were being conducted against African Americans throughout much of that period. In 1876 was also the time for the presidential election. And the person running for the Republican, as a Republican candidate, was Rutherford B. Hayes. And he was running against the governor of New York, Samuel Tilden, who basically won the same number of electoral votes in the Electoral College. So they were tied. What Hayes did was to tell the Southern Democrats that if you vote for me, the first thing I will do is withdraw the troops from the South. They did, and he did.
And he did.
And as a result, you see a new and deadly chapter of white supremacy running unabated. But that kind of thing had been happening virtually since the end of the Civil War. And it was occurring even while the Lincoln Republicans, were in power, both in the White House and in Congress and in the judiciary. And there was no hue and cry against that kind of outrage. And so what Douglass was talking about basically is that principle and practice aren't one and the same. That we have a situation where it's one thing to be a person who could fight for freedom, but once that one-dimensional, though important thing is achieved, you don't do anything else. So you have basically people still dealing with discrimination and poverty and things of that nature.
Why do you think that is, that people lose interest in what happens to you after I've accomplished this great feet for you?
Well, dealing with racism is a very complicated thing, and I think it really, at this time, in the 19th century, people really didn't understand what racism was. They saw it as a challenge that any business person dealing with a downturn would experience. You people, they seem to be saying to black people, your job is to overcome that adversity. Our job is to give you the vote. But the vote doesn't secure the ability to purchase a farm. The vote doesn't secure the opportunity to get an apprenticeship. The vote didn't secure the opportunity of providing, good education for the children, or improving the welfare or housing or any of these things. All of those things were left to a much more social and informal realm. And as a result, black people were still being confronted with, well, that was the result of white friends who basically viewed the struggle for equality as a one-dimensional thing. Our job is to end slavery. Our job is to extend suffrage rights to black men, not to black women. And in doing so, we have done our job. We have done our fair share. The rest of the struggle is left for you. This was the message that's being conveyed. And the reason why that was a message that they could easily do is because that was what they were telling themselves about what it is to be a true Republican, small r. That your job is to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. But the white farmer, for example, or the white laborer has contacts to get jobs and skills. The white farmer, the white laborer had opportunity to purchase a farm. The African American, on the other hand, had to have a white property owner willing to sell the property to the black person, so the black person could vote, but they couldn't purchase things. They couldn't acquire wealth, in effect. But the notion of duty to the African American ended with that one thing. It was noteworthy.
Right.
Because those Republicans went against the principles that they had learned all their lives since the beginning of the nation. The blacks could never be equal. But once that one very important thing was done, they basically walked away from any other responsibilities to African Americans.
Interesting. Wow. I wanted to talk a little bit about the Reconstruction period, 1860 to 1876. And why do you call this period a critical chapter in our history? I know the obvious, but I think there's so much intrinsic in
Yes.
that period. And I would love for you to share a little bit more with us of why that's such a critical chapter in our lives.
Well, Reconstruction was a period of major change because of, number one, the population was changing, huge immigration, especially in the case of Minnesota, where there was much more vitality around the issue of enfranchisement for women. The women's suffrage was becoming a major issue during this time. It would not succeed in the century, but there was more agitation for it at least. Economically speaking, the nation was becoming more industrial. Minnesota, on the other hand, was more agricultural state, but agriculture was not a sustainable entity at this time because in the 1870s you had grasshopper infestation and there was no capacity on the part of the state to help farmers through that period. And one of the Governor Pillsbury, for example, said famously, if you ask me for help, that means you don't deserve it. And he was a person a Minneapolis storekeeper who had gone bankrupt and had pulled himself up. So he sees himself as the embodiment of this Horatio Alger ethos. And that's kind of what's happening across the country. There was no policy or effort to really integrate a new labor force. So you have labor instability, you have farmer unrest, you have the concentration of wealth in the hands of a few. At the same time, when the country is becoming more industrialized, you begin to see a greater concentration of wealth in fewer people. In other parts of the state, the issue of race was still not being dealt with, obviously. We talked a little bit about that. So in just about any kind of way that you want to consider what was happening in the nation, social, political, economic, whatever, ethnic, the nation was going through a change and becoming something other than anything Americans thought it could become. So they were ill prepared. And I might also add that when Frederick Douglass came to speak here, he talked about the status of African Americans. That was his initial speech. Circumstances arose which had him change his message, and we can talk about that later on. But the key thing is that he had an opportunity to give an idea of how we could create an economy that will integrate all of these new forces. He was not an economist, but he could have given some articulation to that need, you know, for policymakers to think in those terms. And he didn't do it because the problems that confronted him, he answered with language from the first part of the 19th century. So he was applying language that was outdated, in other words. And that's kind of how a lot of leaders of the society went. Even abolitionists did not really have the language to describe the nature of race relations. And one of the leading liberals in Minnesota, Ignatius Donnelly, said that struggle is over. We now must turn to labor. And labor increasingly meant white only as opposed to black. So you know, it was a time when people had a hard time recognizing the full dimension, the complexity of that time period, and they perhaps didn't afford themselves the time to figure it out.
Sounds very similar to today. Your book is very relevant, even though it focuses on so much of our history,
Yeah.
especially here in Minnesota.
Well, thank you, thank you, thank you. I think it's another way of looking at issues that confront us, but I don't know that that those books provide an answer as much as a way to articulate how to think about the problem that we face, you know, in a different way.
Well, so, Bill, in each of your 3 books, you focus on specific people that you think kind of tell a story about that is larger than them, about the state of race relations. And so maybe if you want to talk about some of them, the person that I thought was pretty interesting was Martin Wilkinson.
Sure.
Who made a statement in a speech that the first time that you read it, you interpreted as, we've done our part, but if you need us, we'll be there. And later on, you started to think, no, I think he meant, we've done our part, and it's up to you to sink or swim. So if you want to talk a little bit about him and maybe a couple of the other characters in your book.
Well, I came to realize that he meant something differently. He meant what you said he meant, namely, it's up to you to kind of sink or swim. I looked at his life. I looked at the issues that he confronted and how he talked about issues as a way of sort of getting a different lens on the meaning of that statement. He was a person who, I love this guy. He's almost Shakespearean in his complexity and in his tragedy. He's got deep roots in the American history. He comes from Puritan stock. His family started with Roger Williams, who founded Rhode Island. And the tradition in Rhode Island originally was to provide a sanctuary for all kinds of people leaving the tyranny of the Puritans in Massachusetts. And Morton Wilkinson's family, you know, was a part of that tradition. His family moved to upstate New York, and his father was a conductor on the Underground Railroad. And his uncle, his father's brother, younger brother, would become also a conductor on the Underground Railroad and a banker, and the person who established Syracuse, New York, gave it a name. So, I mean, he comes with this pedigree. His cousin is married to a sister of Louisa May Alcott. So there's a deep sort of, you know, tradition, and it would be difficult to tell him that he was unsympathetic to African Americans. He comes to Minnesota, the first liberal, the first attorney, and he's the only one who votes in favor of black suffrage at a time when no one else in the county supports it. So he's got this pedigree. He serves in the United States Senate. His tenure straddles the Civil War, and he's a friend and a tormentor of Abraham Lincoln because Lincoln isn't radical enough. He calls for black enlistment in the soldiers. He wants more appropriations to support the family of black soldiers who sign up. He wants the Emancipation Proclamation argued.
It all sounds really good.
And then,
Yes.
that's right.
So
And-
far.
And he champions black suffrage. He comes back to the state and champions black suffrage in the state. And it's at that he decides, I'm done now.
Okay.
I'm
I've
done
done
now.
enough.
I've
I've
done
done
enough. My only exposure to African Americans is what I'm reading in the white newspapers that are depicting African Americans as being happy and, tranquil, and so he gets the message that, yes, I can move on to another issue. And for him, the issue was farmers, farmer equity, the Grange movement. But he would turn against the Republican Party because he would increasingly see the party as a party of corruption. And that's a common thread among many of the children of Lincoln. They wrapped themselves in the sanctimoniously of being clear of their own virtue, to the point where they could walk away from any more responsibility. And they saw the party that they had created as a party that was now corrupted with money and monopolies and things of this nature. This was Morton Wilkinson's, the remainder of his life. He would be fighting that tradition. And interestingly enough, Minnesota historians don't like to talk about him. He doesn't appear in the textbooks. And yet he was the first senator from the state of Minnesota, Republican senator of the state of Minnesota, and he has quite a legacy, both good and bad. He also argued in favor of exterminating the Dakota, but that's a separate issue.
Okay.
Well, so, okay. So getting back to his statement about it's up to you to sink or swim, or to perish or prosper, I think is what he said. What was his take on the fact that African Americans weren't given 40 acres and a mule, weren't given any of the land, that when Lincoln died and Johnson decided to give the property back to the landowners in the South, what did somebody like Morton Wilkinson think about that? Or did he write about that? Because you can't really pull yourself up if you don't have anything to pull yourself up with.
That's right. That's another element I see with the children of Lincoln. There's a blindness. Excuse me. There's a kind of blindness to the experience of the African American post-Civil War. They begin to suspect that Republicans who are using race issues as a way to encourage voters to support them are being cynical, and that race is cynically being deployed. So there's not really an issue here. To be drawn into that racial issue is, in effect, being drawn into supporting corrupt politicians. So he kind of got into a position where he just refused to pay attention to the press. He even believed that the attitudes of white supremacists about the world not being as bad as you convey, as Northerners convey us, that's all because of the Republican press. And Wilkinson, basically said as much. He agreed with them. He argued that point in the state Senate when he became a state senator. So, in a sense, Wilkinson represents that group of Lincoln children, the children of Lincoln, was willful in their disregard of what was happening in plain view. And there's even a sense of resentment with the African American who had not established. Now, this is a guy who, when he comes to the hotel to stay for his traveling state, he has a black porter, he has a black man trimming his hair. He doesn't have any relationship with African Americans at all. So he could kind of live in this cocoon. He could still see himself as a liberal. In fact, he uses the party label, liberal Republican. That's a former title. He embraces that, while at the same time being suspicious of anyone who advances the issue of civil rights. And one final example of that. In the same year, 1875, well, it's not the same year, but in 1875, when the Civil Rights Act was passed, was created, federal law where you can't discriminate against anything, he was critical of it. He felt that you cannot force people to be with folks they don't want to be with. That's how he cast civil rights legislation and how he saw public accommodations laws to be. You're forcing people to sit next to people that they don't want to sit next to. And that will only create more racial disharmony.
So this is 100-some years ago, 150 years ago.
Yeah.
But to me, it's very relevant to the housing problem of the mid-20th century.
Right.
When all of the housing policies by the federal government
Right.
were to make sure that the races were separate. And so what ends up happening is nobody knows what anybody else's life is like.
Right.
And it's too current. Even though it's 150 years ago, it's still so relevant.
Billy Francis, the wife of Nellie Francis,
Right.
the husband of Nellie Francis, brilliantly described the problem with segregation. It allows well-intended people to believe in illusions.
To sleep at night.
To sleep at night.
Absolutely.
And this was a guy who had been a supporter of Booker T. Washington, you know, accommodationist, a person who had been the good Negro for a long time. But he, you know, was able to see segregation, which was being practiced obviously in the 1920s and earlier, as a way that allowed right-thinking white people, as he described, to just kind of go on with their sense of self-satisfaction.
I had a question, but I've got to take in what you just said. It's so powerful, and it just feels so relevant. It is amazing. Don't read what you don't like. It can't be the right news. Ooh, interesting. What lessons do you think these stories have for us today?
I was motivated in part because of the frustration I saw people experiencing in talking about race. The issue is so big and so explosive. It's one of those few issues where a person's own words can become, you know, self-destructive. And so as a result, people are inclined to just shut down. And I think oftentimes race and race relations rely heavily on words that are laden with negative and perhaps even unfair images. So it allows people to sort of avoid engaging the deeper issues.
Yeah.
It allows people who should be talking to each other to kind of live in parallel worlds. And the end product being, you know, let's just get past this moment. And then we can go back to the way we've always done things. Let's hope that it doesn't come up again. I want to tell stories that basically give us a sense of perspective, to kind of look into the human dynamic that we know all too well today, but from a perspective that allows us to be able to come at these issues in a much more, I think, candid way, in a way, to get language to describe, you know, what's going on that's timely for today. And to not feel alone with our uncertainty about what race is about, because I think that most of us fear being misunderstood. And that's a sure way to shut down communications. I think that I try to depict these people as being good folks or reasonable people who
Right.
were just human, you know. And I just wanted to sort of give another set of tools, if possible, to be able to have those kinds of conversations.
Very good. Kathy?
So I think that I've heard you say that in Minnesota, you grew up in Louisiana,
Right.
New Orleans,
Right.
and so you heard about the iconic leaders, Hubert Humphrey,
Yeah.
Fritz Mondale, and how progressive, for the most part, they have been on race issues. Hubert Humphrey's 1948 speech at the National Convention,
Yep.
talking about coming out from the shadow of states' rights into the full sunshine of human rights.
Right.
But you also talk about in your books around the turn of the century that the leaders were ahead of the public at large in terms of how they were thinking about race relations. Want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because that's an important part of the story as well. The leaders tended to be able to see where we wanted to go. They're the ones who proposed these policies, but they also had to be mindful of the need to bring the populace along with them. And this is one of the things that makes Morton Wilkinson so fascinating to me, because he understood that balance. He recognized that as a leader, you gotta be out in front. You've gotta provoke. You've got to hold people's hands. You gotta say, we're gonna do this together. And because of the relationship you formed with people who are being asked to do something that's inconceivable to them, something that's very threatening to them, there has to be a trust between the leader and the led. And I think that's why Morton Wilkinson is so important, because he represents that kind of, and there were other leaders who were like that. Humphrey, you mentioned Humphrey. But there are others as well who basically recognize that you can't get out so far in front of the people that they will just dismiss you. This is one of the issues that Lincoln had to constantly juggle. You know, how can I change, you know, the vision for this country without seeming too outlandish? I've got to bring these people along. I've got to bring my people along. So I think that, I'm sorry, I missed the question. I'm thinking of
No, it was just, you've answered it beautifully. It
You
was
did
really
a
about,
great job.
yeah, you did a great job. It's all about how leaders can't get too far, the band leader can't get too far ahead of the band, is,
Right.
That's
is
right.
basically what you're trying to say, this balancing act
Yeah.
that leaders have to figure out.
And in addition to that, you know, people may even get to the point where they're willing to listen to reason. But they need to know that a person out front actually has a broader perspective who can assure them that it's going to be okay.
Exactly.
Well, you have done a great job making us feel okay,
Well, I'm glad.
because your stories are so wonderful.
Thank
you
you.
so
So-
much.
So true. Thank you so much for
Thank you.
coming tonight. We really enjoy having you as our guest and learning so much more about our history, because now today doesn't seem quite as frightening. We got through, we'll get through, but you give us a perspective that'll help us.
Thank you very much. That's very kind.
Well, I just want to thank
Very
you
kind.
for watching We the People tonight, and I hope you will tune in next month as we continue to interview and learn more about our history here in Minnesota. Good night.